Yu Yangyi, the 20-year-old star of the Chinese Olympiad team in Tromsø, burst through at the end of the Qatar Masters Open. In the penultimate round, he faced Giri. Here's the position after 86 moves, a really grueling game. And Yangyi has knight and 3 and queen against queen, bishop and 2. This is a theoretical draw, but Yangyi had been playing on, grinding away, and Giri was very short of time. And suddenly the knights and queen look a little bit threatening. White's king is slightly exposed. Now, so far, Giri has been waiting in this endgame, and he could continue to wait with bishop g3, but short of time, Giri cracked. He thought he'd seen that white could make a perpetual check with bishop h6, and if this bishop is taken, then certainly that happens. If the king goes up the board, that would be a slight error. That's actually checkmate. The king goes back, and I think it's easy to see that white makes a draw by perpetual check. But Yangyi had worked this out, and he produced, after bishop h6, this excellent move, queen h2, which Giri had seen but somehow underestimated. He thought there'd be a defence. The point is that if queen takes knight, then queen takes pawn check, wins the queen. So Giri gave a check. Now, king takes would still be a slight error, that's checkmate, but Yangyi just stepped back, and, well, after bishop takes pawn, again taking the bishop would lead to a perpetual, but instead black started a deadly counter-attack. If the king goes up, then this will lead to disaster. So, for example, here, and there's a nice checkmate on h4. We don't even need to bother taking the queen. So Giri played king f2, check, and after this move Giri had to resign. For example, if king e3, then once again a skewer wins white's queen, and if king d3, this is very neat, queen d2 check. The knight's taken, once again there's the skewer, and if king c4, knight d6 wins white's queen on e8. Who would have thought that that queen so far away on the back rank would actually end up as a vulnerable piece? So Yu Yangyi defeated Giri, and going into the final round, that meant there was the encounter between Yangyi and Kramnik. Now, Kramnik was half a point clear. He had defeated the Salem from United Arab Emirates in the penultimate round. So going to the final round, Kramnik with 7, Yangyi with 6.5. Yangyi with the white pieces, and it was a Berlin defence, and Kramnik has a very typical position. I should say Yangyi didn't play for the endgame, but just played 4d3. d3 on the fourth move, and we have a very typical position from this opening. White, I love white's pawn structure. White has this perfect pawn structure. So that gives white a very slight advantage because black's structure has been slightly compromised. But Kramnik is looking good here, I think. He's played his knight to this excellent square e6, looking at these key squares on d4 and f4. But I love the way that Yangyi made the most of his chances here. First of all, he gave a check, forcing the pawn to g6, and then the queen came all the way back to d1. Well, structure is more important than time in this position, and this check is very nice because now it means these squares are slightly weakened. One of white's long-term strategic aims in this position is to force through the pawn break f4, and after exchanges you can see that then the f6 square will be slightly weaker because the pawn is no longer protected by the pawn on g7. Now, this is very abstract at the moment, but much later on this could have an effect on the game. So I really like this check. It's very subtle. Kramnik played bishop c5, preempting this knight c4 move which was played. And now here I think that black should be fine. Could just castle here. He could also play queen d7, but instead Kramnik lashed out with b5. To my eyes, that's the most uncharacteristic move from Kramnik, allowing this knight into this square on a5, and looking at this weak pawn on c6. Normally Kramnik has much more respect for his pawn structure. Bishop e3. So that's a nice move from white. If the bishops are exchanged, then we can see that pawn on e3 does an excellent job of covering d4 and f4 key squares. But also you can now see the effect that the advance of the g-pawn has. So although white is not winning this pawn, there's just a little bit more pressure, when white doubles or maybe triples on the f-file. So Kramnik just step back to b6. I think that's fine. And b4. Now you can see the slight problem. White, in some cases, would like to just drop that knight back to b3 to try and control the c5 square. And there are problems with this pawn structure. I don't like it that these squares on c5 and a5 have been weakened. Now here, Kramnik, to a certain extent, could solve some of those problems by advancing the c-pawn. But after this exchange, well, I think it's clear to my eyes that white still stands slightly better here. He has the better pawn structure. There are no weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Okay, black also isn't too bad here. The knight is still on this great square e6. But white is slightly better. But I think that's what Kramnik should have done. Instead, again, another very uncharacteristic move from Kramnik. f5, lashing out. So now there are pawn weaknesses all over the place. I really don't like black's position. Now on a good day, this f-pawn could perhaps advance here, but it's a very crude kind of threat, I have to say. Yangyi played excellently. I like queen c3. A simple double attack, actually. So black has to take steps to somehow meet this. After the game, Yangyi thought that, or said he was expecting white to play like this. And I think this is a good chance to try and complicate the game. So although white wins a pawn, for the moment, this rook and bishop are a little bit sidelined. And black has managed to get this pawn to f3 to try to open up white's king. Now, a variation like this is extremely sharp. Now, if this were a blitz game, well, I would favour black every time. Now, in classical chess, where the players have time to think through their moves, it's another matter. But still, this is unpleasant. And Yangyi said that he might well have forced a draw in this position, like this, with queen e5, and so on, repeating the position. White could play on with this move, bishop e3, but this is a very, very complicated position. And, well, Yangyi might well have forced a draw there. Instead, Kramnik advanced, forcing this exchange, and now knight c6. And here Kramnik just, I think, overlooked a tactic. I think the best chance is to play f3. Now, there are problems with this move. White can play like this, and if white wants, white can force an endgame with queen b3. This is a tricky variation. If this knight is captured, then rook e1, followed by taking on e6. Instead, black can exchange queens and go for a worse endgame. And white at the moment is, let me see, after the capture on g2, white will be 2 pawns up. But, white's pawns are incredibly bad here. There are no connected pawns, so black would have drawing chances. There's another move which is possible. You could take on f3, which allows this sacrifice. Now, you'd have to be very brave playing white to allow this sacrifice. You know, at first glance, it looks as though black should be winning this position. In fact, my computer tells me that after this move, queen c7, white is still doing very well. But to appreciate that in a game and to be able to calculate all these checks here and this attack on white's king, well, you would have to be very brave, or perhaps have a brain of silicon. So yes, f3 looks like a far more dangerous move, and I can. Yangyi thought that he should probably play that endgame. But instead, Kramnik played queen d6, and as I said, I think he overlooked a tactic here. White exchanged on a7. And now, perhaps Kramnik had anticipated knight d4, which looks very strong for black, trapping white's knight, threatening a check on e2. But here, the amazing tactic knight takes b5, which Yangyi had seen, is actually very strong. If knight e2, then white goes into an endgame with many extra pawns, and if knight takes knight, of course, there's queen c4 check and a double attack, and white again has many extra pawns. So yeah, but easy to overlook because it's a strange kind of move. So finally, Kramnik lashed out with f3, but here it's a much better version for white. That queen on c6 does an excellent job of controlling sensitive squares on this diagonal. Probably black should exchange here and play this position, but I think white can control this. The king will pop back to h1, and it is very important that white controls this diagonal, and white should be fine. Instead, Kramnik played king h8, but after g3, that kind of locks things down on the king's side, and black's queen simply doesn't have time to get in on the light squares here. Good move from Yangyi. Very good move. He wants to trade pieces. This is exactly what happens. And white, with so many extra pawns, 3 extra pawns here, is winning. So the game finished like this. h4, good move. And this check really doesn't achieve much. And after e4, a desperate move from Kramnik. Queen takes e4. Kramnik resigned. So after the exchange of rooks, for example, then white picks up yet another pawn, and black's knight on h3 is also trapped and eventually will be lost. So a convincing last round victory for Yu Yangyi. Just a wonderful achievement in the last 2 rounds, defeating the top 2 seeds, Giri and Kramnik, and he therefore won the tournament with 7.5 out of 9, clear first, a half a point ahead of Kramnik and Giri. So Giri won his last round game against the Kopian, and Kramnik, well, he had 6 wins in a row in the middle of the tournament, but yes, a disappointing last round defeat. I mean, many people saying that well, he doesn't really like playing at such an early time in the day. The game starts at 12 noon in Qatar, 3 hours earlier than normal, and really, I think many of Kramnik's moves here were most uncharacteristic of his normally solid style. Having said that, Kramnik did gain rating points in this tournament, as did Giri. Giri 7th on the live rating list, 7th in the world, and Kramnik now 8th in the world on the live rating list. It was a fantastic tournament in Qatar, very, very exciting games. I will be back home soon, and I'll be commentating at the London Chess Classic, so hopefully I'll be giving you a few reports from there. Thank you very much.